somewhere in the high desert of New Mexico, there's a canyon that shouldn't make sense. Walk into it today and you'll find silence, wind, sagebrush, a few tourists reading interpretive signs. But look closer, look at the walls rising out of the rock, and you'll find something that has quietly unsettled archaeologists for over a century. Multi-story buildings, some with 600 rooms, some aligned so precisely to the sun and the moon that modern engineers have used laser surveying equipment just to confirm what a culture, with no written language, no draft animals, and no wheel, apparently pulled off by eye. And then, sometime in the 12th century, they left. Not slowly, not through conquest, not through any war we've found evidence of. The people who built one of the most sophisticated urban centers in pre-Columbian North America appear to have walked out of their canyon in the span of what may have been less than 2 generations and never fully returned. They left behind sealed rooms, ceremonial objects still in place, turquoise, macaw feathers from birds that don't live within 1,000 miles of this canyon, and an engineering legacy so advanced that we are still mapping its full extent using satellite imagery today. This is the story of Chaco Canyon and the people history calls the Ancestral Puebloans. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, we're going to walk through the 3 competing theories for why this civilization's heart stopped beating. And I promise you, the most recent one is not what you'd expect. It involves the sky itself. But to understand why they left, we first need to understand what they built. And that story is stranger than most people realize. Let's set the scene. Chaco Canyon sits in the arid northwest corner of what is now New Mexico. It is, by any modern standard, a terrible place to build a city. Rainfall averages less than 9 inches a year. There's no permanent river. Temperatures swing from scorching summer heat to bitter high desert winters. Nothing about this landscape says, build here. And yet, between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, the Ancestral Puebloans, sometimes still called by the older, contested term Anasazi, built here anyway. Not a village, not a scattered collection of pit houses, a complex. A network of monumental great houses so precisely engineered that archaeologists initially assumed the labor and planning behind them required a centralized state, something closer to what you'd expect from Mesoamerica, not the American Southwest. At the center of it all sits Pueblo Bonito, and this is where the mystery really begins to take shape. Pueblo Bonito was, at its height, a D-shaped complex of roughly 650 rooms, standing up to 4 and 5 stories tall. For almost 700 years, it was the largest building in North America, not surpassed in room count until parts of New York City were constructed in the 1880s. Let that sink in. A structure built without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals to haul material, remained the largest building on the continent for the better part of a millennium. But size isn't even the strangest part. Because buried inside the walls of these great houses is a mathematical secret that wasn't fully understood until the 1970s. A secret involving the sun, a spiral carved into rock, and a discovery that would completely change how historians viewed ancestral Puebloan science. We're getting there. But first, you need to understand how they built at all, because the logistics alone are almost as strange as the astronomy. Here's a number that stops most people cold. An estimated 240,000 trees. That's the current scholarly estimate for the number of timber beams used in construction across the great houses of Chaco Canyon. Ponderosa pine, spruce, fir, species that do not grow anywhere near the canyon floor. The nearest viable forests are in mountain ranges over 50 miles away in multiple directions. There were no horses in North America at this time, no oxen, no wheeled carts. The wheel, strangely, was known in the Americas only in the form of small ceramic toys, never scaled up for transport, which means every single one of those 250,000 logs was cut with stone tools and carried, on human shoulders, across desert terrain, in some cases for distances exceeding 60 miles. Researchers using strontium isotope analysis on the wood have traced timber sources to at least 2 distinct mountain ranges, the Chusca Mountains to the west and the San Mateo Range to the south, suggesting a coordinated, long-distance labor and logistics operation that lasted for generations. This wasn't a one-time building project. This was industrial-scale infrastructure, sustained continuously for over 2 centuries in one of the most resource-poor environments in North America. And the roads tell an even stranger story. Archaeologists have identified over 180 miles of ancient roadways radiating out from Chaco Canyon, engineered routes, some up to 30 feet wide, cut with startling precision through solid rock where terrain demanded it, rather than curving around obstacles the way a practical trade path normally would. Several of these roads run dead straight for miles, seemingly built for ceremonial or symbolic purposes rather than efficiency, since walking a slight curve around a mesa would have been far easier than blasting a straight line through it. One of them, nicknamed the Great North Road by researchers, runs almost due north for over 35 miles, seemingly pointing toward nothing in particular, unless you consider that nothing in particular, on the ground, might have meant everything in the sky. Because here's the detail that made this into one of the biggest archaeoastronomy discoveries in North American history, and it's about to explain why Chaco Canyon may not have been a city at all in the way we think of cities. It might have been something closer to a machine. In 1977, an artist named Anna Sofer was documenting rock art on a butte inside Chaco Canyon called Fajada Butte. She wasn't an archaeologist. She wasn't looking for astronomy. She was cataloging petroglyphs. But on the summer solstice, she noticed something that stopped her in her tracks. 2 massive sandstone slabs, leaning against the cliff face, were channeling a shaft of sunlight into a narrow dagger of light. And that dagger fell directly through the center of a spiral petroglyph carved into the rock behind them, at the exact moment of solar noon on the solstice. Sofer returned. She documented it across seasons, and what she found was staggering. The same rock formation produced different light patterns at the winter solstice, and different patterns again at the spring and fall equinoxes, each one interacting with the spiral in a distinct, deliberate way. 2 smaller daggers of light bracket the spiral at the winter solstice. A single dagger bisects it exactly at the summer solstice. This wasn't an accident of geology. The slabs had almost certainly been deliberately positioned, shifted, shimmed, adjusted to calibrate this effect. The ancestral Puebloans had built, out of raw sandstone with no written mathematics as we'd define it, a solar calendar precise enough to track the turning of the seasons to within a day or two, using nothing but shadow and light. And it doesn't stop there. Casa Rinconada, a massive great kiva south of the main canyon, contains a doorway and window alignment that channels the first light of the summer solstice sunrise directly across the floor to illuminate a specific niche in the opposite wall. Pueblo Bonito's outer walls include sections aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that rivals structures built with modern surveying tools. And the Chacoans tracked something even more difficult than the solar year, the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle, a subtle wobble in the moon's rising and setting position that takes almost 2 decades to complete a full cycle. Several great house structures, including Chimney Rock, far to the north, appear to be aligned specifically to catch the northern minor lunar standstill, a phenomenon so gradual that tracking it would have required multiple generations of continuous, disciplined observation, passed down deliberately as sacred and scientific knowledge. Think about what that means. This wasn't one gifted astronomer working alone. This was an institution, a body of accumulated, transmitted, tested knowledge, sustained across at least 2 centuries, in a society we once assumed was too simple to produce anything beyond basic subsistence architecture. So if this was a civilization capable of tracking the heavens with this level of precision, capable of moving 250,000 log timber hauls across desert terrain, capable of building the largest structure on the continent, what could possibly make a society like that walk away? That's where the story turns dark, because the leading theories aren't just about drought, they're about something closer to social collapse. And there's disturbing physical evidence buried in the walls of Pueblo Bonito itself that most tour guides won't tell you about. We'll get to that. But first, let's talk about who actually lived here, because the power structure inside Chaco Canyon may be stranger than the buildings themselves. To understand why Chaco Canyon fell apart, we first need to talk about something archaeologists spent decades avoiding: the bodies. Beneath one room in Pueblo Bonito, a chamber designated Room 33, excavators in the early 20th century uncovered one of the richest burial deposits ever found north of Mexico. 2 adult males were interred beneath a wooden plank floor, surrounded by an almost unbelievable wealth of grave goods: over 11,000 pieces of turquoise, shell trumpets, ceremonial staffs, and ornate pendants. Beneath them, further down, additional burials, layered over generations, along with more turquoise than has been found at almost any other site in the ancient Southwest combined. This is the detail that quietly rewrote what we thought we understood about Chaco society. For a long time, scholars pictured ancestral Puebloan culture as fundamentally communal, egalitarian farming communities loosely bound by shared ceremony, without kings, without dynasties, without the kind of stratified hierarchy you'd associate with, say, Maya or Aztec civilization. Pueblo peoples today, the living descendants of this culture, largely describe their traditional social structures in exactly those communal terms. But Room 33 doesn't look communal, it looks dynastic. A 2017 genetic study analyzing DNA extracted from the individuals buried in that room across multiple generations found something remarkable. The burials followed a maternal line. Different individuals, buried up to 330 years apart, shared the same mitochondrial DNA, meaning they were descended from the same woman through an unbroken maternal lineage and were given the honor of burial in this one specific, wealth-laden chamber for over 3 centuries. That is not the burial pattern of an egalitarian society. That's the burial pattern of a ruling matrilineal dynasty, something closer to what you'd find in more centralized, hierarchical civilizations elsewhere in the ancient world. Hiding in plain sight inside a canyon we assumed was structured completely differently. And that single discovery cracks open an uncomfortable question that we're going to sit with for the rest of this video. If Chaco Canyon was ruled by an elite dynasty commanding immense labor and tribute from outlying communities, what happens when that system breaks? Because there's a theory, one gaining serious traction in recent archaeological literature, that the collapse itself might have been political, not environmental, not mysterious, a revolt. But before we get to that theory, we need to walk through the other 2, because each one adds a piece to the puzzle the others can't fully explain alone. The most widely cited explanation for Chaco's decline is also the most straightforward: climate. Tree ring data from the region, and the American Southwest has some of the most detailed tree ring chronologies in the world, thanks to decades of dendrochronological research, shows a severe, sustained drought beginning around 1130 CE and persisting for the better part of 50 years. Some researchers describe it as one of the most significant aridity events in the region's environmental record over the past 2,000 years. for a society already farming at the absolute margins of viability. Remember, this canyon receives less than 9 inches of rain annually, even in good years. A 50-year megadrought isn't a hardship. It's existential. Maize agriculture, the backbone of the Chacoan food supply, would have failed catastrophically, year after year, with no long-term recovery in sight. On the surface, this looks like a clean answer. Climate changed, agriculture collapsed, people left to find better land. Case closed. Except it isn't that simple. And here's why. Chaco Canyon's population had already been declining, according to construction and refuse-midden evidence, in the decades before the worst of the drought hit. Major construction projects had slowed. Some outlying great houses show signs of reduced occupation, predating the driest years by a significant margin, which means drought alone doesn't explain the timeline. Something else was already destabilizing the system before the climate delivered its final blow, and that something else is where things get genuinely disturbing, because the second theory doesn't just involve failed crops. It involves evidence, found in the bones themselves, of violence that some archaeologists have been reluctant to even publish. We're going there next. Stay with me. This is the part of Chacoan archaeology that even professionals find uncomfortable to discuss publicly, and for decades, many chose not to. Beginning in the 1990s, physical anthropologist Christy Turner and others published a series of controversial studies examining skeletal remains from several sites across the broader Chacoan world, including sites like Cowboy Wash, southwest of the canyon itself, that showed patterns consistent with extreme, systematic violence. Perimortem breakage of long bones, cut marks consistent with defleshing, evidence of skulls burned on hearths, and in a small number of cases, biochemical evidence suggesting the practice of cannibalism. The findings were, and remain, deeply controversial. Some researchers have proposed these were acts of warfare or extreme punishment. Others have connected them to a documented cultural pattern found in later historic Pueblo oral tradition, the concept of witchery, the execution and ritual destruction of individuals accused of sorcery, particularly during times of severe social stress, drought, or perceived betrayal by community leaders. If the Chacoan system really was a hierarchical structure, propped up by tribute, labor obligations, and ritual authority claimed by an elite lineage, the kind suggested by that Room 33 dynasty, then a prolonged drought wouldn't just threaten crops, it would threaten the legitimacy of the people who claimed spiritual authority over the rain, the harvest, and the cosmic order itself. In societies where leadership is bound up with claims of control over natural forces, catastrophic and prolonged failure of those forces can trigger a crisis of faith in the system. And, historically, in more than one culture worldwide, that crisis has ended in the violent repudiation of the ruling class blamed for it. Some archaeologists now argue that what we're seeing in the skeletal record isn't random violence, but the targeted punishment of individuals associated with a failing elite order, a system unraveling from the inside as its authority collapsed alongside the reins. And that theory dovetails with something even stranger that we haven't discussed yet. What happened to the people after they left Chaco Canyon? Because they didn't vanish, and where they went, and what they apparently tried never to repeat, might be the most telling clue in this entire mystery. We'll get to that in a moment, but first, the third and final theory, and it's the one gaining the most traction among researchers today. A combination collapse, driven not by any single cause, but by all of them compounding at once. Modern archaeology has largely moved away from single-cause explanations for the abandonment of Chaco Canyon, in favor of what's often called a systemic or cascading collapse model. And honestly, this is probably the most intellectually honest answer we have. Here's how it likely unfolded. According to the current consensus view woven together from decades of excavation, isotope analysis, dendrochronology, and osteological study, by the late thousands and early 1100s, Chaco had grown into an enormously complex regional system, sometimes called the Chaco world, encompassing well over 100 outlying great house communities across a region roughly the size of Ohio, all connected through roads, ritual obligation, and likely tribute in the form of labor, maize, and goods flowing toward the canyon center. That kind of system requires two things to survive: a stable climate to sustain agricultural surplus, and a population that continues to believe in the legitimacy of the ruling structure demanding that surplus. When the drought hit in the 1130s, both pillars failed simultaneously. Crops failed, and an elite class whose authority was partly built on ritual command over rainfall, celestial cycles, and cosmic order suddenly looked powerless in the face of the one thing they claimed dominion over. Trust broke down. Tribute relationships from outlying communities appear to have unraveled. Without steady labor and food flowing inward, the Central Canyon could no longer sustain its population, its construction projects, or its elite. Some residents likely left peacefully, migrating toward the Rio Grande Valley and the Hopi Mesas in search of more reliable water sources. Others, in a smaller number of documented cases, may have faced the kind of violent reckoning suggested by the skeletal evidence at outlying sites. Within a span that some researchers now estimate at less than 60 years, startlingly fast for a civilization of this scale, the great houses of Chaco Canyon were largely emptied. But, and this is critical, they were not destroyed. They were not burned in war. They were, in many cases, deliberately and ceremonially closed. Doorways were sealed with masonry. Rooms were filled in, layer by layer, with rubble and sediment in what looks like intentional decommissioning rather than a hasty flight. Some rooms contain items left in place, ceramic vessels, ceremonial objects, suggesting a structured, ritualized departure rather than panic. This wasn't a civilization destroyed. It was a civilization that, in the end, chose to leave, deliberately closing the door behind it. And that detail, the deliberateness of the abandonment, is what makes the next part of this story so important. Because the ancestral Puebloans didn't disappear off the face of the continent. Their descendants are alive today in the Pueblo communities of New Mexico and Arizona, and in Hopi oral tradition specifically. There is an account of this exact period, one that describes Ledving not as collapse, but as a choice, tied to a covenant, a migration, and a warning about the dangers of centralized power that echoes almost exactly what the archaeological evidence now supports. This is where the story stops being purely archaeological and becomes something closer to oral history intersecting with hard science, and where it gets, frankly, a little chilling. Multiple Pueblo nations today, including Hopi, Zuni, and several Rio Grande Pueblo communities, maintain origin narratives describing a period of migration from ancestral centers in the north, often associated archaeologically with the Chaco region, toward their present-day homelands. These migration narratives are typically framed not as fleeing disaster, but as fulfilling a spiritual obligation, a series of planned movements tied to covenants, clan responsibilities, and the completion of specific ceremonial cycles. Some Hopi accounts specifically describe periods of ancestral life marked by the corruption of leadership, disputes over power, and a conscious decision to leave, rather than continue, under a system that had lost its way, remarkably resonant with what the archaeological record now increasingly supports independently. What's striking is how well this lines up with the physical evidence. Tree ring-dated construction at sites like the Rio Grande Pueblos and the Hopi Mesas shows population growth beginning right around the time Chaco's population was declining, suggesting a genuine, traceable migration rather than a sudden vanishing. And there's one more detail that tends to give viewers chills. Many of the outlying communities that emerged after this migration were built smaller and in many cases more defensible. Cliff dwellings, mesa-top villages, structures positioned in locations chosen explicitly for protection. Places like Mesa Verde's cliff palaces, built in the century following Chaco's decline, show architectural choices strongly suggesting a population that had learned, the hard way, not to concentrate power or people in one indefensible, resource-strained location ever again. In other words, the descendants of Chaco Canyon didn't just move. They appear to have redesigned their entire approach to civilization in direct response to whatever happened in that canyon. And that raises the single most unsettling question in this entire investigation. If the people who lived through the Chaco collapse rebuilt their society specifically to avoid repeating it, what, precisely, were they trying to prevent from happening again? Because there's growing evidence, from a site even more remote and even less understood than Chaco Canyon, that whatever happened here may not have been an isolated event. It may have happened before, somewhere else, centuries earlier, and the parallels are almost too exact to be coincidence. That story, the one connecting Chaco Canyon to an even older, even stranger predecessor civilization buried deeper in the southwest past, is where our next investigation picks up. Before we move forward, we need to go back, because there's an entire dimension of Chacoan engineering we haven't touched yet, and it might be the most quietly astonishing part of this whole story. Water. Remember, this canyon receives less than 9 inches of rainfall a year. By modern agricultural standards, that's not marginal farmland, that's desert. And yet the ancestral Puebloans didn't just survive here. For roughly 2 centuries, they thrived here, feeding a population large enough to build and maintain the largest structures in North America. How? The answer lies in a water management system so subtle that archaeologists walked past evidence of it for decades before recognizing what they were looking at. Chacoan engineers built an extensive network of check dams, canals, and diversion structures designed to capture something most of us would never think to harvest: runoff from rare, brief, but intense summer thunderstorms. When rain does fall in this region, it tends to fall hard and fast, flash flood conditions rather than gentle soaking rain. Most of that water, left to its own devices, simply sheets off the surrounding mesas and disappears within hours. But the Chacoans built stone and earthen structures specifically engineered to intercept this runoff at the mouths of side canyons, funnel it through constructed canals, and direct it into gridded agricultural plots below the canyon walls. This is, in essence, a form of ancient hydraulic engineering, capturing and redistributing a resource so scarce and so fleeting that most cultures wouldn't have bothered trying. The Chacoans didn't just endure this environment. They engineered around one of its harshest limitations with a level of hydrological sophistication that some researchers have compared, in principle if not in scale, to irrigation systems developed independently in the ancient Near East. And this detail matters enormously for our larger mystery, because it tells us something crucial about vulnerability. A society that has built its entire food supply around capturing rare, unpredictable storm runoff is a society with almost no margin for error. There's no buffer, no reservoir of stored surplus that can absorb a multi-year shortfall. When the rains that fed this fragile system failed for an extended period, there was no engineering workaround sophisticated enough to compensate. The system had been optimized for scarcity, but not for catastrophe. Which brings us to something even stranger. Recent satellite and LiDAR surveys have revealed that this water canal network extended much farther than anyone previously suspected, connecting to outlying communities dozens of miles away, in a pattern that some researchers now believe may represent the first evidence of large-scale, coordinated water rights management in North American history. We'll touch on what that implies about Chacoan governance in a moment, but first, let's talk about the outliers themselves, the mysterious great house communities scattered across the desert that made this entire system possible. Here's something that tends to surprise people who assume Chaco Canyon was an isolated settlement. It wasn't. Not even close. Archaeologists have identified well over 150 outlying great house communities scattered across the San Juan Basin and beyond. Structures built in the distinctive Chacoan architectural style, using Chacoan construction techniques, some located over 90 miles from the canyon itself. Sites like Aztec ruins and Salmon ruins to the north, Chimney Rock high in the Colorado mountains, and dozens of smaller outliers form what researchers now call the Chaco world, or the Chacoan regional system, a network stretching across an area roughly comparable to the state of Ohio. These weren't independent settlements that happened to copy a popular architectural style. The precision of the connections is what makes this remarkable. Many of these outlying great houses are physically linked to the canyon by the engineered road system we discussed earlier. Roads that, remember, were often built dead straight through difficult terrain rather than following the path of least resistance, suggesting the roads served ceremonial and political functions as much as practical trade routes. Some outliers, like Chimney Rock in southern Colorado, appear to have been specifically cited for astronomical reasons, positioned to frame the northern lunar standstill between twin rock spires, visible from a great house built directly beneath them. This wasn't incidental. Someone chose this remote, difficult-to-reach location specifically because of what the sky did there every 18.6 years. So what does this tell us? It tells us Chaco Canyon likely functioned as the ceremonial, political, and possibly economic capital of an enormous decentralized network, something closer to what anthropologists call a peer polity system, or possibly a more centralized hierarchy, with Chaco Canyon itself serving as the ritual and administrative core. And this is where the story of collapse becomes even more consequential. Because if Chaco wasn't just one settlement, but the central node of a 100-plus community network spanning an area the size of a small US state, then its decline wasn't a local event, it was a regional cascade. When the canyon's authority weakened, outlying communities that had spent generations sending labor, maize, and tribute inward would have had every incentive, and increasingly every necessity, to stop. This is the piece that makes the systemic collapse theory so compelling. It wasn't one city failing, it was an entire, interconnected regional system losing its center of gravity all at once. And here's a detail that rarely makes it into mainstream documentaries. Some of these outlying communities show evidence of continued, even increased construction activity in the decades immediately following Chaco's decline, as if power, resources, and population weren't so much vanishing as redistributing, which raises an uncomfortable question we'll return to before this video ends. Was Chaco's abandonment really a collapse at all? Or was it something closer to a system correcting itself, shedding a failing center in favor of survival at the margins? Let's talk about something that, on the surface, seems like a minor archaeological footnote, but is actually one of the most tantalizing clues in the entire Chaco mystery: the artifacts that had no business being there at all. Excavations at Pueblo Bonito and other great houses have turned up macaw skeletons, scarlet macaws, to be precise, a tropical bird species native to regions of Mexico and Central America, over 1,000 miles to the south. These weren't just feathers, incidentally traded hand-to-hand across the continent. Archaeologists have found the remains of live transported birds, meaning someone, at some point, carried live scarlet macaws across deserts, mountains, and over 1,000 miles of unforgiving terrain, almost certainly for ceremonial or elite status purposes. Alongside the macaws, copper bells, cast using lost wax technique, a metallurgical technology known from Mesoamerica but never independently developed in the American Southwest, meaning these objects were manufactured elsewhere and imported. Marine shells from the Gulf of California and the Pacific coast, hundreds of miles away, worked into ornaments and ceremonial objects. Cacao residue, chocolate, found in ceramic cylinder vessels at Pueblo Bonito, chemically confirmed through residue analysis, representing physical proof of long-distance trade contact with cacao-producing regions of Mesoamerica over 1,000 miles south. This is staggering when you sit with it. Chaco Canyon, sitting in an isolated high desert basin with no navigable rivers and no domesticated pack animals, was nonetheless plugged into a trade network stretching deep into Mesoamerica, moving live tropical birds, cast metal bells, and chocolate across a distance comparable to the length of the Silk Road's shorter regional segments, using nothing but human porters walking on foot. Some researchers have gone further, proposing that Chacoan elites may have deliberately cultivated connections with Mesoamerican civilizations, specifically to import prestige goods that reinforce their own authority back home. Macaws and chocolate serving the same symbolic function that gold and silk once served for elites in entirely different corners of the ancient world. Visible, exotic proof of a ruling class's reach and power. And that theory dovetails disturbingly well with everything else we've uncovered so far. The matrilineal dynasty in Room 33, the ritual road network, the astronomical precision. All of it starts to look less like the work of an egalitarian farming society and more like the apparatus of a genuine political elite, actively legitimizing its rule through cosmology, trade, and monumental architecture, exactly the kind of system that, historically, tends to be most vulnerable when its foundational claims of legitimacy are suddenly, publicly disproven. Which brings us back, finally, to the question we've been circling this entire video. What actually happens when a system like that breaks? Here's something worth sitting with before we close this investigation. Chaco Canyon's story is not unique in human history. It's part of a pattern. Across the world and across different centuries, we see strikingly similar collapse sequences in complex societies that concentrated power, resources, and ritual authority into single dominant centers. The classic Maya lowlands in the 9th century, parts of the Khmer Empire at Angkor, even elements of the Bronze Age collapse across the eastern Mediterranean. In case after case, the pattern rhymes. Environmental stress arrives. A system already stretched to its logistical and political limits fails to absorb the shock. Elite legitimacy erodes as the ruling class's claimed connection to cosmic or divine order is publicly undermined by visible failure, and the population disperses, sometimes violently, sometimes peacefully, towards smaller, more resilient, more decentralized ways of living. Chaco Canyon fits this pattern almost perfectly. A centralized ritual political authority, dependent on cosmological legitimacy and a fragile agricultural base, operating at the absolute margins of environmental viability, collapses within a period of decades once drought removes the resource surplus that held the entire system together. What's remarkable and genuinely rare in the archaeological record is how much evidence survives here that lets us reconstruct not just that it happened, but how, in granular, physical detail, tree rings recording the exact drought years, isotope signatures tracing the movement of timber and labor, skeletal evidence hinting at the violence of the unraveling, genetic evidence proving a dynastic elite existed at all, and living oral tradition, carried forward by Pueblo descendants today, describing the moral and spiritual dimensions of a departure that archaeology could never fully capture through artifacts alone. 3 lines of evidence: physical, biological, and oral, all converging on the same essential truth. Chaco Canyon was not destroyed. It was outgrown by its own ambition, undone by an environment it never fully controlled, and ultimately abandoned by people who chose survival over loyalty to a failing system. That, in the end, might be the most human story in all of American prehistory. Let's go deeper into something we touched on earlier, because it deserves far more attention than a passing mention: the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle, and why tracking it may represent one of the most impressive sustained scientific achievements of the pre-Columbian Americas. Here's the challenge in plain terms. The sun's rising and setting position shifts predictably across a single year. That's the solstice and equinox cycle most ancient cultures worldwide learn to track. It's observable within one human lifetime, often within a single season if you're paying close attention. The moon is a different problem entirely. Its rising and setting position also drifts across the horizon, but the extremes of that drift, the northernmost and southernmost points the moonrise will reach, shift across an 18.6-year cycle, not a single year. To notice this pattern at all, you would need to track moonrise positions patiently, methodically, across nearly 2 decades, and then recognize the pattern repeating, meaning realistically, verifying it once would require the observational lifetime of an elder, transmitted to a successor, verified again, and only then trusted as genuine astronomical law rather than coincidence. This is precisely the kind of achievement that separates casual skywatching from institutional science, knowledge that requires a system, not an individual. A society capable of tracking the lunar standstill needs dedicated observers, a method of record-keeping precise enough to span decades, and a cultural mechanism for transmitting that observational data faithfully across generations, all without a written numerical system in the form we'd recognize. And the Chacoans didn't just track it, they built architecture around it. At Chimney Rock, high in the mountains of what's now southern Colorado, a great house was constructed directly beneath 2 natural rock spires, positioned so that during the northern lunar standstill, the rare configuration reached only once every 18.6 years. The full moon rises perfectly framed between the 2 spires, visible from the great house doorway. Researchers analyzing tree ring dates from the site's construction have found compelling evidence that major building phases at Chimney Rock cluster suspiciously close to actual lunar standstill years, strongly suggesting the site's construction schedule was deliberately timed around this celestial event. Similarly, at Chaco Canyon itself, certain great house wall alignments, including specific windows and corner geometries at Pueblo Bonito, appear oriented not just to solstice sunrise, but to the more subtle standstill positions of the moon, requiring builders to have already known in advance where those extreme lunar positions would eventually fall. This is worth pausing on, because it reframes everything we think we know about who the ancestral Puebloans were. This is not the profile of a technologically simple society. This is the profile of a culture that had developed something functionally equivalent to an institutional scientific tradition, sustained, transmitted, and architecturally encoded over multiple human generations, without writing as we define it, without metal tools, and without the wheel. And here's a chilling thought experiment worth sitting with. If this culture had the discipline and continuity to track an 18-year celestial cycle across generations, they almost certainly also would have had the observational tools to notice climatic patterns unfolding over years, meaning some archaeologists now suspect Chacoan leadership may have seen the drought coming, at least in its early stages, and simply lacked any structural way to adapt the system fast enough to survive it. Knowledge, in this case, may not have been enough to prevent collapse. We'll sit with that unsettling idea for a moment before moving to our final section. Let's return to that 2017 genetic study of Room 33, because it deserves a fuller explanation than we gave it earlier. This is one of the single most important pieces of evidence in the entire Chaco mystery, and it changed the field in ways that are still being debated. The research, led by geneticist Douglas Kennett and colleagues, extracted and sequenced mitochondrial DNA from individuals buried in room 33 across what the accompanying tree ring and stratigraphic dating suggested was a span of roughly 330 years. The results showed that these individuals, spanning multiple generations, buried at different depths within the same sealed chamber, shared an identical maternal genetic lineage. In practical terms, for over 3 centuries, one specific matrilineal family line was granted the singular honor of burial within the most lavishly furnished chamber ever excavated in the ancient Southwest, surrounded by tens of thousands of turquoise beads, ceremonial staffs of office, and imported shell ornaments. This finding matters because it directly challenges the egalitarian farming society model that dominated Southwestern archaeology for much of the 20th century, a model partly shaped, understandably, by present-day Pueblo communities' own descriptions of communal governance, and partly by an academic reluctance, in some circles, to project hierarchical, state-like political structures onto indigenous North American societies without overwhelming evidence. Room 33 is that overwhelming evidence. A genetically continuous ruling lineage, granted exclusive burial rights in the wealthiest chamber in the region for over 300 years, suggests something closer to an inherited aristocracy. A ruling house, not unlike dynastic lineages, documented in complex societies elsewhere across the ancient world, expressing power through matrilineal descent rather than the patrilineal models more familiar from European or Mesoamerican history. And this detail carries enormous weight when we return to the collapse question. Hierarchical systems built around hereditary legitimacy are, historically, particularly vulnerable to crises that undermine the perceived source of that legitimacy. If the Room 33 lineage's authority was tied, even partly, to claimed influence over rainfall, celestial order, and agricultural success, a 50-year megadrought wouldn't just threaten crops, it would represent an existential collapse of the ruling family's core claim to power. This is precisely the mechanism some archaeologists now propose to explain both the abandonment and the disturbing violence found at some outlying Chacoan-affiliated sites. Not simple starvation-driven desperation, but a targeted, ideologically motivated reckoning against a ruling order that had lost its legitimacy in the eyes of the people it once governed. There's one more twist to this genetic story that rarely gets covered in mainstream documentaries. Some researchers studying the broader Chacoan genetic record have proposed that the influence of this Room 33 lineage may not have been confined to the canyon itself, but may show up in DNA signatures at outlying Great House communities as well, suggesting the ruling family's reach extended physically, not just symbolically, across the wider Chaco world. If true, that raises a question we're still working to answer. Did that bloodline survive the collapse? Did it continue somewhere else, under a different name, in a different form? That's a thread current researchers are still actively pulling on, and one we may return to in a future episode. If you visit Chaco Culture National Historical Park today, you'll find a place that, on the surface, feels almost anticlimactic compared to everything we've just described. There's no ticket booth crowd, no towering pyramid silhouette recognizable from a postcard, just wide-open sky, sandstone cliffs, and low, sprawling stone walls that require a trained eye to fully appreciate. But once you know what you're looking at, the canyon transforms. That unassuming curved wall section, part of a 5-story building that stood taller than anything else on the continent for 700 years. That narrow, sealed doorway, a deliberate closure, possibly ceremonial, possibly the final human act performed in that room before it was abandoned forever. That distant butte on the horizon, home to a sun calendar so precise it took modern researchers years of seasonal observation just to document what its builders apparently understood well enough to encode in stone. Every visible feature here rewards patience and context, which is, in some ways, a fitting metaphor for the entire Chaco Canyon mystery itself. This isn't a story that reveals itself through a single dramatic artifact or a single dig season. It's a mystery painstakingly reconstructed from tree rings, isotopes, mitochondrial DNA, oral tradition, satellite imagery, and decades of careful, patient archaeological work. A mystery that rewards exactly the kind of sustained attention its builders once devoted to the sky itself. So let's land this properly. What we now understand about Chaco Canyon paints a picture far more sophisticated and far more human than the vanished civilization framing that so often gets attached to stories like this one. This was not a primitive society that mysteriously blinked out of existence. This was a highly organized, hierarchical, astronomically sophisticated culture, one capable of monumental engineering, transcontinental trade, precision celestial tracking spanning generations, and coordinated governance across a network of more than 150 communities spread over an area the size of a small state. And when it ultimately came apart, it came apart through an entirely explicable, deeply human sequence of events, environmental catastrophe colliding with a rigid, centralized system of inherited authority, until the legitimacy holding that system together simply gave way, not instantly, but over the span of a few devastating decades. Its people did not disappear. They carried their knowledge, their trauma, and their lessons forward into new, more resilient, more decentralized communities, the living Pueblo nations of today, who still, in oral tradition, remember pieces of this story that archaeology is only now catching up to. But, and this is the thread we're going to pull on next, Chaco Canyon increasingly looks less like an isolated event in the history of this continent and more like a recurring pattern. Because there is another site, deeper in the archaeological record, older than Chaco by centuries, showing an eerily similar trajectory. Rapid monumental construction, evidence of a centralized ruling elite, precise astronomical alignment, and then, just as abruptly, near total abandonment. If Chaco Canyon is the second chapter of this pattern, what does the first chapter look like? And more importantly, is there a third? That's exactly where our next full investigation picks up. We've also released an extended feature-length upload, covering material that didn't make it into this episode, including newly available LiDAR survey data revealing previously undocumented structures scattered across the greater Chaco landscape, structures archaeologists didn't even know existed until the last few years. If you want to understand where this story truly begins, and where it might still be going, that's the video to watch next.